Chapter 4. Surviving Harsh Winters. The warm, breezy summer gave way to a cool fall, and then winter quickly set in. Neither Zino nor the Drokes were prepared for the brutal cold, strong winds, and heavy snows of winters on the high plains. As winter set in on the high plains in 1892, Zino began to believe he had made a terrible mistake, which he actually had, by his own admission, many years later. The cold became nearly unbearable. He had filled all the holes in the chinks of his simple stone enclosure with mud and hand-layered over many layers of rough-cut juniper logs as a roof. He had built it against the side of a giant boulder, limiting the wind's access. It was not enough. By mid-December, the temperature dropped down to about negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit every night. He slept in his clothes, wrapped up in 2 woolen blankets he had earned from the Drokes, and curled up on a bed of juniper boughs near the fire. To keep the fire burning so he would not freeze to death, he had to force himself to wake up every hour or so to add more wood to the fire in his makeshift fire pit in the center. Severe cold and sleep deprivation became his normal, bare, desperate existence. In such need, he thought and thought about how to improve his situation. He tried different sizes of fires, making a heavy covering out of more juniper branches, and exercises to keep his tired muscles from cramping too painfully. The best solution he was finally able to find was to build a good-sized fire right against one solid wall formed by the boulder. He had to arrange his crude roofing to make a hole for the smoke to escape through. After a period of days, the boulder began to retain and radiate the heat it had collected. He began to trust sleeping 4 or 5 hours before needing to restore the fire. Many years later, as a very old man, Zino would sometimes speak to the giant sandstone wall, as a survivor would to a rescuer, like it was his long-time friend. In Spanish, he would say things like, "You are my solid old friend. We have been through some very hard winters, eh? Yes, I like that you are always standing in silence." When Joe Gandy was born in 1923, 6th son of a 7th son, Zino was already in his mid-50s in age. He had come to know several of the new homesteaders fairly well, including Joe Gandy's parents, who started there in 1905. The Gandy's homestead lay several miles from the rimrock. As the boy grew, he proved to be a regular lone explorer. By the time he was 10 years old, Joe discovered Zino's little crooked-fenced sheep ranch down in Chickawauk Canyon by himself while hiking. Zino's place became a destination for the boy. Few of Joe's siblings took any interest in the old Mexican man. Joe's early friendship with Zino when he was a kid grew more intense after Joe's father was gunned down in cold blood by a hired killer in 1931. Zino became a safe, detached, different kind of father figure to the 10-year-old Joe. Zino was just the kind of hard-nosed but fair-minded mentor Joe took to. From Zino, he learned many life lessons about being a man and also how to speak Spanish. Zino also taught Joe how to drink whiskey and tequila. All of his tale Zino had told to Joe, a little at a time and over many years, making Joe one of only a handful of people who ever knew both his story and the stories of early days of homesteading by the Droke family and a few others. Joe's long reverie about Zino's life came to an end as he noticed the side trail that led shortly to Zino's place. He and his horse walked up to the stone lean-to in another half an hour. Zino heard them coming and stepped out the door. "Hola, Joe! I have not seen you in many moons," he greeted. He walked up and shook hands with Joe, then took the reins and led Banjo into his little hay shed and fed him some hay. "Come into supper, Joe. I am making tortillas and beans. You are welcome to have some with me." "Sounds just wonderful, Zino. I've got some victuals in my saddlebag we can add to your beans," Joe replied. While Zino served the tortillas and beans, Joe pulled the biscuits, cheese, and jerky out and spread it on the table. He looked around for a tequila bottle, but didn't see it. Zino saw his sidelong glances and said, "Oh, I am sorry, my friend. I have nothing more than coffee to drink. I have not been to town in weeks. You will have to make do with coffee, is bien?" Joe felt both relief and intense disappointment simultaneously, but responded evenly, "Not a problem at all. I'm not drinking much anymore anyway." Zino sat down at the table and looked Joe in the eye. "That is muy bien, my friend. Muy bien, I think, for you," Zino said encouragingly. Joe stayed that night, but left very early the next morning before Zino was awake. Chapter 5. Joe Meets Rosie. Joe rode his horse slowly up the cow trail out of Chilcoot Canyon. The sun stood just above the horizon after a long, tiring day of herding polled Hereford cattle. Riding out on top of the rim rock, Joe spied a woman nearby in her late 20s, about Joe's age, standing very still with a cardboard box in her hand. Joe silently stopped his horse and watched her. He soon saw that she was intensely staring at an old, ragged jackrabbit about 10 yards in front of her. She was slowly moving towards the rabbit, clearly intent on capturing it in the box. Joe thought he recognized this rabbit. It had been around for at least 4 years. 4 rough years, it seemed. Its left ear was missing a few inches from the tip. The other ear had a big notch in it. Its fur was mangy, with many tufts sticking out at crazy angles around bald injuries. The sight so surprised Joe that he laughed out loud. The jackrabbit jumped 4 feet straight up in the air and then bounded away at top speed. Clearly, it outlived its lifespan through sheer speed. The young woman dropped her box and shook her finger at Joe. Joe just laughed harder. "Hey, cowboy, why'd you have to go and do that? Can't you see I was about to catch that rabbit? If you hadn't scared the tarnation out of it!" She glared at Joe. Taken aback, Joe's mouth dropped open and he simply sat in the saddle and stared at her. After a bit he said, "Well, sorry, girl. I've just never seen anybody dumb enough to try to catch a jackrabbit on foot with a box. They can run 25 miles an hour. Why, I've never been able to get closer than 10 feet to one, except for shooting it first. Besides, they are strong and real vicious. They have big teeth. If you were to get one in that little cardboard box, it would chew its way out and then chew on you, and I mean right quick." "Well, I'll swanny. It doesn't look that hard. I'm no girl, by the way. After all, I have 4 children. My name is Rosie. Anyway, a jackrabbit might make a good pet. I bet you're fast enough to catch one. Have you ever even tried to catch one before?" Rosie pressed. Joe looked out over the prairie at the now stopped jackrabbit, looking back at them in the distance, and slowly shook his head. "Well, that particular old jack would make a right shag-nasty pet. He's all skin and bones, honest, that one. He won't last another winter," he finished quietly. Rosie walked over to Joe and looked him closely in the eyes and said, "Looky here. I think you can do it. I want you to run as fast as you can and go get that rabbit for me. You can do it. You want to get that rabbit for me. Go ahead." Joe's eyes stared into her eyes and locked for a moment. They dilated. Then he turned and started running towards the jackrabbit, his arms outstretched to capture it. He chased it for about a half a mile, and then suddenly stopped out of breath and looked confused. "How in the hell did she get me to do that?" he wheezed out in a whisper to himself. It actually was not his first experience being hypnotized, of course. He slowly walked back to his horse, keeping a weather eye on Rosie. "That's the last time you'll get me to do anything that fool crazy, missy," he growled at her. "Oh, pooh! Say, tell me, what's your name, cowboy?" she teased. "Joe," he answered simply. "Well, it was nice to meet you, Joe. I'm Rosie. I'll be seeing you around. I'm Helena's niece. I'm just here on a visit from the great state of Texas." Joe climbed up into the saddle and regarded her with a grimace. He had never much cared for any of the Texans he had met. "Okay. Rosie. Texas, huh? Yeah, I'll be seeing you, I guess," Joe said as he rode off. They saw each other again the very next Sunday. Helena had especially asked him to Sunday dinner, which he had not attended in months. Helena cooked meals for everyone on the ranch, but most days Joe skipped her meals in favor of simple sandwiches poached eggs and toast he made in the bunkhouse. He showed up at the ranch owner's back door, dressed in clean but wrinkled Levi's, his usual metal-button Western dress shirt, and clean dress boots, and clean straw Stetson hat. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, his skin was weather-beaten and sunburned. He had cuts on his hands and bruises on his face. Helena was bustling about the kitchen, so Rosie answered Joe's knock at the back door. "My stars, Joe, don't you just look like 26 miles of bad road? What have you been doing, wrestling alligators?" Rosie demanded. Joe looked at her with a frown and acted surprised. "What do you mean? I wore my best outfit." "Sure, nice dads, but you look like you could use some Band-Aids and some sleep," she said, surveying him up and down. "What you really need is a good woman to help you take better care of yourself." Uh-huh. And I suppose you fancy yourself you could be that woman, huh, Rosie?" Joe replied with a frown. Rosie tried to smile and frown at the same time as she spat out. "Me? Now look here, Joe. I'm married. My husband Dieter is still down in Houston. You're going to have to find yourself a different girl. I'm already taken." At summer's end, Rosie left the Groden Ranch and returned to her husband Dieter in South Texas. She and her husband tried to make their marriage work for a few more years, but Rosie became increasingly agitated with him. She finally left, taking her 2 youngest children with her, returning to the ranch in Colorado. Her aunt Helena helped her figure out how to mail paperwork to the state of Texas to file for divorce. She had to get Dieter to agree to the divorce, or the state would not have granted her one. He grudgingly did agree. After the paperwork was filed, Rosie began to occasionally spend a little time with Joe Gandy. She saw Joe as someone who seemed lost, without any specific ambitions or plans, other than to work 6 days a week as a cowboy, and all the rough treatment that entailed. She definitely did not like his drinking. She joined Joe and Helena some Sundays to talk about books, history, and local gossip. It was about the 3rd such Sunday when Joe asked Rosie to go to a rodeo with him. He wanted her to watch him ride a bucking wild horse in the rodeo. Helena was weary with watching Rosie sulk around the house, so she strongly encouraged her to accept the invitation. Rosie went with Joe to a rodeo in La Junta the next Saturday. After he got bucked off a young quarter horse, Joe grimaced in pain and then laughed a little as he picked himself up out of the dirt. He dusted off his clothes and asked Rosie, "You want to get a drink?" Rosie was not much of a drinker, but she agreed to a beer and sipped it while Joe slugged back 3 shots of bourbon whiskey. She became concerned as Joe became drunk. When he started smiling wide and saying goofy things to her, she suggested he drive them home. "All right, Rosie, let's braid our hair and take off over there," Joe yelled as he tugged on her hand to lead her back to the pickup truck. He opened the passenger door for her and helped her climb in. Then he quickly leaned over and kissed her hard, right on the mouth. She found herself kissing back. She looked steadily at Joe as he crossed in front of the hood. It was clear that he was very drunk. As he started the engine, she asked, "Are you sure you're okay to drive? You seem like you're about 3 sheets to the wind." Joe smiled a big sloppy grin and wheeled the pickup out onto the gravel road, leading back to Villa Green. "Sure, I drive just fine, thank you very much. Besides, if I drank myself out cold, you could drive us back, right?" "So?" Rosie frowned at Joe and stiffly replied, "Well, no. I don't know how to drive. That stinking old Dieter would never teach me." Joe showed obvious surprise. Most of the women on the high plains could drive almost anything. He mulled this information over for a while in silence as he drove. Finally, he came to a firm conclusion in his mind. He pulled the pickup over, parked it, and got out. After walking around to the passenger side, he opened the door and told Rosie, "Shove over, you're going to drive." Rosie laughed in surprise and yelled, "Land sakes, I already told you, Joe, I can't drive." "Sure you can. I'll show you how. One time and you'll never forget," Joe said as he slid into the passenger seat, shoving her bodily into the driver's side of the bench seat. Flustered, surprised, but intrigued, Rosie took on Joe's challenge and listened intensely as he sloppily described the clutch, brake, accelerator pedal, gear shifter, and steering. She caused Joe to cuss under his breath a few times as she ground the gears and killed the engine by popping the clutch too quickly. But in just a few minutes she gained the ability to start the engine, put the pickup in gear, and drive smack down in the middle of the road. Shifting gears badly, but getting the job done. She drove all the way back to the ranch and felt very excited about it. Although Joe was not a very patient teacher, she liked that he thought she should be able to drive, and then made sure she quickly learned. Her respect for Joe grew that day, even though his drinking worried her some. Then she wondered if he would ever do such things when he was sober.